The enemy will often attack the very thing that you're called to. In fact, when I was like 7 years old, I would preach to my dolls. I'd come home from church on a Sunday, sit all my dolls in their little seats, and I would preach sermons to them. And I would ask my dolls so sincerely, who would like to give their life to Jesus? This was like a dream of mine. Like I wanted to get up on stage and preach. And often the very thing that we fear and the very thing we love is the exact thing that we should pursue. My name is Riley Keogh, and you are listening to the Called for More podcast. Thank you so much for choosing to spend today with me. I'm stoked to be here with you. So today I was thinking about the question, what is it exactly that you are called for? What is the more that God wants in your life? And see, God has predestined you for good works, and He has plans to prosper you and not to harm you. And He wants you to live radically. The tagline of this podcast here is to kill apathy and live radically. And that is because God wants you to live this life that not only where you are radically changed as a person to become more like Christ, but you also make a radical difference on the lives of people around you. And as Christians, we choose to mark and to follow the example of Jesus' life. And Jesus was only on earth here for 33 years, and yet He made such a difference. There is no other human in history that has made as much difference as He has. No other politician, no other king, no other queen. And He lived a radical life, and His life was so much about others. He saw people, He prayed for people and they got miraculously healed. He prayed for people and demons left. He prayed for people and their whole lives were changed. And I just want to start off to encourage you that you are called for more, but what exactly is the more? And this is something I feel so passionate about. The more, your more in life is to live a courageous life. And the great enemy of a courageous life is fear. So I have a question for you. What would you do if fear wasn't holding you back? Let me ask that again. What would you do if fear wasn't holding you back? What life, what person would you become if you were beyond fear, if you lived a life on the other side of your fear? See, fear it takes all sorts of forms in our life. It might be like something small, like a fear of spiders, or it might be the fear of rejection or fear of failure or fear of dying. But it's crazy when we think on our lives, fear is something that is impacting us every single day. And the cousin, I like to call it, the cousin of fear is comfort. In other words, like comfort, like us choosing to live only in the comfort zone is what is happening, is like a byproduct of a life where we are surrendering to fear instead of submitting to courage. And so I wrote this book called 3 Seconds of Courage. And the tagline is how small acts of bravery lead to big change. And so I just wanted to get on this podcast and sit with you today and talk a little bit more about courage and fear. And before this podcast, I was doing a little bit of research about fear and how it's impacting our lives. And I'm sure you can feel it. We live in just a fear-soaked society. 52% of adults aged 18 to 29 feel anxious always or often in the past 12 months. 31% of adults cite fear of failure as the biggest obstacle preventing them from reaching their goals. In fact, 64% of people admit they avoid pursuing their dreams because of fear of failure. 4 in 5 Americans feel very lonely, and fear of rejection prevents 75% of people from asking for help or connection when they need it most. So I have had quite a journey with fear, and I have had moments in my life when my fear was so overwhelming, I just felt completely paralyzed. And maybe you can relate to that. And just to share a little bit of my story, I was 10 years old and my family traveled to Thailand. We went there to go visit my grandfather. He would live half the year. He lived the dream. He would live half the year in Italy, and then the other half of the year he would be in Thailand because he was following the sun. He only liked summertime, so he would spend his summers in Italy and then his summers in Thailand. And so we went to go visit him. It was 2004. And we also went, my parents growing up were huge on missions work. And so we also worked at this orphanage that rescued children from the sex trade. So after this time of volunteering, my parents had booked us to go to a vacation. It's kind of like an island, but it's technically a peninsula, but the only way to get there is via boat. But just imagine, like, the only way you get there by boat. And when you're on this boat, I just remember sitting as a 10-year-old little girl at the front, and there's just crystal clear water. There was like, you could see the fish in the water. There's massive cliffs on these islands. And Thailand is known for like hundreds of islands that are on the coast. And so a few days before Christmas, we show up to this resort. So we're on this boat and we pull up into the sand, and I see my grandfather, and I run up to him and he gives this massive bear hug. And I remember in that moment just feeling like just like tension left my body. And so we spend the next few days at this incredible resort. And the way that this peninsula was shaped was it was like flat in the middle with two big cliffs on either side. And it was so small that it took like 2 minutes to walk from one side of the peninsula to the other. And the day after Christmas, this was one of the days that I feel like was the birthplace of so much of my fear. See, sometimes it almost feels like we're born with fear. Some fears that we experience, or some fears are just natural, like coming of age. Fear, like when you're a teenager and you are feeling awkward about talking to your crush. But then there's also the origin story of our fear. We go through something traumatic, something hard, and our body and our minds respond to that hard thing with fear because we get scared and we realize like life is a lot scarier than we thought it was. And so the origin story of a lot of my fear was this day after Christmas. And that was when I woke up in the morning to an earthquake, and then I rushed into my mom's room, and I'm like, mom and dad's room. And I'm like, what's going on? And my mom was like, earthquake, don't worry. Cause I was so confused. I was 10 years old. I'm like, I don't understand. Why is all the things like falling off the walls? And the ground is shaking. And then there was an earthquake in the morning. We continued on with our day. And that is when the 2004 Boxing Day tsunami struck. And long story short, my family had to run for our lives. And I was running for my lives as a 50-foot tsunami was surging behind me. And truly, I shouldn't be alive today. And it's an incredible story that I share of God's grace and provision in our lives that I share in my book, 3 Seconds of Courage. And so if you want to like read that whole story, go grab a copy of this book. But the reason I share that story with you is because I saw death and devastation, and I was so terrified of just life and the ocean, and struggled with PTSD and had horrible nightmares, and just my whole life was abruptly, radically changed from this day. I lived through something no one should ever live through. I saw sights and sounds no one should ever see. And I was a 10-year-old little girl, and it felt like my life was like, there was so much innocence up into that moment. And then you live through something so traumatic as that, it just, your whole life changes. And it felt like, honestly, my innocence changed. And so this was one of the moments in my life where fear started. And then fear decided to grow and grow and grow. And I am so impressed with my parents because 6 months after surviving the tsunami, my parents enrolled my sisters and I in beach lifeguard training, which, I mean, guys, just imagine that. Imagine having just lived through a tsunami, terrified of the ocean, don't want to go anywhere close to the ocean, and then your parents are enrolling you in beach lifeguard training. as in learning to rescue people in the very place that you were terrified of. And I was like, this is the last thing that I want to do. But on the first day of training, my hair is a mess. I've nervous peed like 20 million times and I'm exhausted. I just had a nightmare that night, the night before. And my dad comes up to me right before we're about to jump in the car and go to our first day of training. And he says something that just changed my life. He said, Riley, you are fighting a battle between courage and fear, and all you need is a little more courage. And so that idea of a little more courage, of just needing just more courage than fear for me to be able to live a courageous life, has caused a ripple effect on my life. And so this idea of us facing our fears is the first practical point that I want to give you. First of all, I want you to imagine, like, what is it that you're scared of? What is it that you feel fear of? Maybe it is fear of man, or like fear of other people's opinion, or fear of rejection. Or maybe it's something like me. It's you're afraid of the ocean, or you're afraid of spiders, or dark rooms, or claustrophobia. Now, imagine being forced to face your fears. In fact, that is exactly what God wants you to do. And in the Bible, one of the most repeated commandments is do not fear. And God doesn't say that. And he's not like he's expecting us to live a life fearless, but he's expecting us to live a life where fear isn't making our decisions. Let me say that again. God isn't expecting you to live a life fearless, but He's expecting you, and he's hoping for you and dreaming for you and wishing for you to live a life where fear isn't making your decisions. See, if fear is in the driver's seat of your life, then your life is not going to live into the purpose and the callings and to captivate on the giftings that God has given you. And it's okay if fear is like in the back seat, because I don't know about you, but like, even as I've overcome my fear, I still hear sometimes the voice of fear. I still am impacted by fear most days. But fear no longer is in the driver's seat of my life. Courage is. And the most courageous person I know is Jesus. So I'm like, Jesus, you be the driver, take the wheel. Okay. And so I was reading an article the other day, and it said that exposure therapy research suggests that 60 to 90% of individuals overcome significant fear by gradually facing them. So whatever fear that it is that you thought of before, I want to encourage you, what would it look like for you to face your fear? And that's why I wrote this book, 3 Seconds of Courage, because I want to teach you how to have these micro moments of you facing your fear. And so when I was, I had this very much like irrational fear growing up, and it was of balloons. And I know it sounds ridiculous, but it was of balloons popping. And that was because when I was younger, my family would go all out on birthdays, and it was so cute, guys. Like, we would wake up, and I would wake up in the morning. My family would rush into my room, sing me happy birthday. We'd walk into the kitchen. There's literally hundreds of balloons everywhere. And then there's like French toast, bacon, eggs, just like a massive breakfast feast on the table. And breakfast is my favorite meal of the day, so I was in heaven. But then afterwards, after breakfast, my mom would come along with a knife and like pop the balloons. And I don't even know why, but something about that I got scared of balloons. And so if people pop balloons in me, I would like freak out. My heart would race and I'd dip. And so there was this one time where I'm like 18 years old, and I finally go to one of my first ever parties. And it was like pretty low key party, but there's people in this like person's apartment, like some people are drinking, there's music, and there's a guy there that I had a crush on for a really long time, for like over a year. And I finally get the courage, bring out the courage to talk to him. And I'm sitting there talking to them. And then out of the corner of my eye, I see somebody grabs a knife, and there's balloons there, and pops a balloon. And it was just instinctual. I just ran out of the house and drove home, and my crush messaged me. He messaged me and he was like, "Are you good? Like, what happened? You left." And I never replied to him. And so I was like, enough is enough. Like, I need to be exposed to my fears. And so I started to, for every friend's birthday, I would go to the dollar store, grab some balloons, blow them up and then give them to my friends. And it was a way of teaching me to face my fears. And the funny thing is I would like give my friends these balloons, but they were like so small, like the tiny, because I was so afraid of them popping. So I'd like blow them up like tiny, tiny little balloons. But I wanted to read this part of my book. It's in chapter 6. I said, this balloon experience helped me realize that the more we expose ourselves to our fears, the less power fear have over us. Constant exposure leads to tolerance, which can make us feel more confident to face your fears. You see, we all have fears. Maybe it's something small like balloons or spiders, but sometimes it's something much more serious like fear of failure or rejection or getting hurt or losing control or dying. And so one of the things is that I want you to understand is that the enemy will often attack the very thing that you're called to. And he loves to attack it by evoking fear because fear can paralyze us. And so growing up, one of the things I love to do and that I felt called to do from a very young age is preach. And in fact, when I was like 7 years old, I would preach to my dolls. I'd come home from church on a Sunday, sit all my dolls in their little seats, and I would preach sermons to them. And one of the sermons I would preach to them was called, Are You a Doer or a Butter? And it was saying either you like do for God or you make excuses and say, but God, what about this? And then at the end, my little sermons to my dolls as a 7-year-old little girl with my curly hair and my little lisp because I had a hearing disability, I would do an altar call and I would ask my dolls so sincerely who would like to give their life to Jesus. And then I would go around and lift every single doll's hand up in the air. And I would every week would have 100% conversion rate. And I was like, I'm the best preacher in the world. Like, who can even do that? And anyway, but this was like a dream of mine. Like, I wanted to get up on stage and preach. And often the very thing that we fear and the very thing we love is the exact thing that we should pursue. And so as I mentioned earlier, had a hearing disability. And for many years as a kid, my parents didn't actually know. And they sometimes would just think I was just being disobedient. But if I couldn't look at my parents and read their lips, I wasn't able to hear them. And my hearing is like, when you mow the lawn, I don't know if you've ever even mowed the lawn before, but when you see people mowing the lawns, they wear like those ear muffs on them. That's like what my hearing is like 24/7. It's like wearing kind of like noise canceling AirPods all the time. And so, I mean, thank God I received so much speech therapy and have been able to learn to communicate since being a young girl. But when I was young, I couldn't communicate. I couldn't even say my own name. I had a lisp. It was a struggle. I couldn't understand other people. I've always been that kind of person that like never meets a stranger. I always meet a friend, and I loved making friends. And so primary school was so difficult for me because all I wanted to do was just make friends with people. But then I was like, I can't understand you. You can't understand me. And so I remember this one moment. It was like in middle school, and the teacher had asked me to stand up and read a chapter of the book that we were studying in our English class. And I stand up, I'm holding the book, I'm ready to speak. And I couldn't. I was just like in my head, I was like, Riley, fears winning, fight back. But I was so freaky. I'm like, these girls, I went to an old girl school. I'm like, these girls are going to like laugh at me. Like, I was like, they're going to hear my inability to communicate properly. And I just freaked out. And the teacher was like waiting. It was awkward silence. And then some girls started laughing at me. And the teacher told me to sit back down and ask somebody else to read. And after that class, this young, sweet girl walks up to me and she goes, hey, I've also really struggled with fear and fear of speaking in class too. In fact, fear of public speaking is one of the most common fears in the world. And she just told me that, and it was so sweet of her. But the reason I share that story with you is because fear wants you to believe that you're alone, that you are the only person experiencing what you live through. It wants you to think that there's no one else that can relate. And yet fear is very much a shared experience. And psychologists, they did this study to figure out what people fear, what percentage of it actually ends up happening. We can have, if you've struggled with anxiety before, you know what it's like to know that there's so many scenarios that you imagine happening, the worst case scenarios. And yet psychologists found that 85% of what we fear never happens. And yet fear keeps so many from living fully. I want to share another story with you. So I was like 12 and my sister and I, we lived on a farm growing up. If you don't know this about my story, I was born in London, but then I grew up on a farm in New Zealand. And then I've been spending the last 7 years living in America. And when I was 12, we were living in New Zealand and we lived on this big farm that had a forest. And so my sisters and I would go up playing in the forest for hours on end. And my parents were really big on just like having a childhood and playing and just like having fun. In fact, my mom had this theory that she said, however old you are is how many years of age you are is how many minutes of homework you should do. So if you're 10 years old, you should do 10 minutes of homework. But I'm like, Mom, there's no way I'm going to finish all my homework. My teacher's going to be mad at me. But anyway, she had that theory because she wanted us to like go be a kid, go have fun. And it was cool because my childhood was so full of, I know this kind of sounds random, but boredom. And like I was just given, you walk into a restaurant these days and you see a kid given an iPad, but I don't know if you had the similar childhood as I did. Like we would go to a restaurant and you would just like play games out of the sugar or like you'd be creative, and boredom breeds curiosity and curiosity breeds creativity. And so I'm so glad I had this kind of childhood that was just like so fun, so much play. So my sisters and I one day were exploring through the forest and we usually brought our dog with us, and this forest was massive. And so the dog would always, if we got lost, would always guide us back home. But this day, one particular day, we didn't have our dog with us. And so we got lost. And then all of a sudden, I hear this noise of just like, it sounded like tons and tons of wild pigs. And in the area that we lived in, the boar there, like the wild pigs, they had, why am I forgetting the name? They had, guys, this is what happening when you're like pregnant. They had tusks. I remembered it. They had massive, thick tusks, and would like chase after other animals, or even there were stories of them chasing after other humans. So we hear this massive sound of it. Sounds like, I thought it was probably like a pack of like 24 boar. And my sister asked me and she's like, how many boar do you think that was? Like, she's like looking at me scared. And I was like, hey, just underestimate it. Act like way more casual. I'm like, I think it was like 12 or 6. Anyway, so we keep going. And then the sound of these wild animals sound closer and closer to us. Then we see what we were scared of. And there was 2 tiny, skinny little piglets playing in the mud. And I'm like, how in the world did these 2 little cute little things make that much noise? And I share this with you because so often our fears, the threats that we believe will do us harm, are usually not as horrible as our imagination depicts them. In other words, fear wants us to believe the illusion rather than the reality. Like here we were convinced it was this huge pack of boar with tusks that were going to stab us to death. And yet it was 2 tiny, cute little piglets. And, when I was a kid, I used to believe that there was like monsters underneath my bed. And I would sprint from the bathroom into my bed and like leap into my bed because I was convinced like a monster was going to grab my arm. And so one day I like turned on the light in the middle of the night because I was freaking out about this monster. And I was like, Riley, just look under the bed, face your fear. And I look under the bed and there was nothing but a pile of like old books. And this is so often what happens when we face our fears is, yes, I want to say to you, yes, you probably are like me, that you have so many very understandable reasons to be experiencing fear. And yet you are so much greater than your fear. And yet the God that lives within you can overcome and conquer anything. And God wants you to live this life where fear is not like hindering you and keeping you bedbound. And so fear, when we believe and we think that fear is so much bigger and nastier than it is, we often make rash decisions. But I heard that fear has two meanings. Either it means forget everything and run, or face everything and rise. Forget everything and run, or face everything and rise. But I just want to take a moment and note that there is two types of fear. There's helping fear and there's hindering fear. Because sometimes our fear is actually there to help us. It's a God-given gift. It's kind of like a security guard that God put in us of like, hey, let's maybe not walk down that dark alleyway. Like there's like the fear that is tied with wisdom, but then there's the hindering fear. It's the fear of failure. It's the fear of rejection that stops you from pursuing your dreams, from living a courageous life. And when I was in high school, I learned this idea of opportunity cost. And it means essentially every decision you make, there's a cost for it. An opportunity cost is the second best alternative when you make a decision. So for example, Friday night comes around, you have some friends, they invite you to a birthday party, but instead you decide to stay home. The opportunity cost of that decision was going out to hang out with some friends and have some great connection and build your friendship. And there comes a point when our lives, the opportunity cost of constantly listening to fear becomes too much. And maybe you are at that point where you're like, enough is enough. I want to live a courageous life. I want to live a life where fear is not in the driver's seat of your life. So there in one of the chapters of my book, I share this story, 3 Seconds of Courage. I share the story about how I had just moved from New Zealand to Los Angeles, and I went to, it was like a Bible study for a church, and it was at this house in Hollywood. And I walk in and I was like, everyone in the room, I'm like, pretty sure everybody here is like an actor or is famous. And I was like, I'm so like, what am I even doing here? And I just moved from New Zealand to America and had been only in America for a week, in Los Angeles for a week. I was like still learning how to drive on the other side of the road. I'm like, what is a social security number? And why is there like 28 options of milk? And yeah, I was like, I remember one time I was like, totally thought it was fine to like give out your social security, like your number, but you know, definitely don't do that, guys. Protect your social security number. Or there was this other time, I'm getting so sidetracked right now, but there was this other time where I was asked to put down your emergency contact. I started MMA training. They wanted my emergency contact, and I just put down my own name because I was like, I didn't know anyone. Like, who's going to be my emergency contact? Anyway, so I walk into this house. It's a Bible study. People are going around and they're sharing. At the beginning of the Bible study, they ask people to go around and share, like, where are you from? What are you doing? Like, what do you do? What's your name? So I share a little bit about myself. And as I'm sharing, this guy from across the room is staring at me. Then he just like kept, even as we moved on to the next person, he kept looking at me. And he walked up to me after the Bible study and like introduced himself. And straight away, I was just like, this guy's cool. Like, I wanted his approval so bad. I could just tell, like, he was just, you know, you just meet those people and you're like, please like me. Like, I really want your approval. And I was new in this country. I didn't have any friends, and I met him and I really liked him. And I was like, I want to be this guy's friend. So we having this conversation, and he's like telling me about his life and what he does. And then he says to me, he's like, it's so cool that you got into the master's program that you did. And that was the reason I moved to America, to do this master's in global leadership. And it was at Fuller Seminary. And he's like, it's so cool that you did that. You're in that program. He's like, I know it's so hard to get into. And I was like, yeah, I mean, I'm pretty sure it was, because this program that I did only had 28 people would go through it per year. So it was like a smaller cohort. And he says, oh, it's so awesome you go to Harvard. And I just have this moment where I was like, do I say something? Like, I'm not going to Harvard. And I was just like, okay, but just, it's not a big deal. Don't say anything. Like, you really want this guy to like you and you really want to be his friend. So just chill. And so it's this decision that I made in these few seconds, and I chose not to say anything. Carried on. I let him believe that I went to Harvard and just allowed this lie of omission. And this lie grew so much. It ended up being something because I had never corrected him. And then we kept hanging out and he became one of my closest friends over the next 2 years. And wherever we would go, he would proudly introduce me as his friend that went to Harvard. And I didn't say anything. And it was eating away at me. And it would have been such a simple choice, but the fear of him rejecting me or him no longer liking me or wanting to be my friend was what preventing me from living a courageous life, from living a life of being a truth teller. And so I eventually ended up separating from him because the lie and my conscience and how guilty I felt so much that I just stopped replying to his text messages, and stopped just hanging out with him. And just because every time I would be with him, I would feel so guilty. And then at this time in my life, so 2 years into our friendship, I'd stopped. Our friendship came to a halt. And I was taking this class at my master's program called Pastoral Care and Addictions. And it was one of my electives that I chose. And as part of this program, you had to go to 12-step programs. And I don't know if you've ever heard of 12-step programs, but they have 12-step programs like Alcohol Anonymous, or Heroin Addicts. And it's helping people who are struggling with an addiction come together as a community and overcome their addiction and learn how to live a life where their addiction is no longer. And so we were required to go and just sit in the back, not say anything, and just observe this program. And so I walk into my very first ever program that I'd been to. It was an Alcohol Anonymous. It was 10 minutes from my house. I parked my car. I intentionally showed up 10 minutes late because I didn't want to I was so nervous. I was like, I don't even know what to expect. And I walk into the back of the room and there I encountered one of the most courageous group of people I have ever experienced in my life. There was just so many diverse people in that room, and yet they were showing up week after week to confess their sins, to confess their faults, to confess messing up, being honest and vulnerable. It was like a room full of people that weren't wearing masks. And I had spent so much of my life wearing a mask of just trying to impress others and be somebody who I wasn't. And it was costing me my authenticity. And so I'm sitting in the back of this classroom, and this lady gets up and she starts talking about step 9, which is to make amends to anyone you've ever hurt because of your addiction. And she shares about how she had hurt somebody in the depths of her addictions 9 years earlier, and had written that person a letter asking for their forgiveness. And she's standing up there. She was this beautiful lady, wearing Chanel. And she's like, I feel so much peace. I feel so much freedom. And I felt jealous of her. I felt so inspired, but also jealous of her freedom, of her courage to reach out to somebody that she had hurt and ask for forgiveness. And I was just like, I have to leave right now. And I got up out of the classroom and I ended up sending a voice message to my friend telling him, hey, I had lied to you. I'm so sorry. I was so nervous, guys. I was just my hand was shaking and my voice was shaking, and I just pressed send. And there, my friend, is so much peace and freedom on the other side of your courageous decision. And see, I am so glad that I finally faced this mistake that I had made, and this mistake I had made because of fear of man and fear of rejection. And that feeling when I pressed send was undescribable. And I want you to live into that feeling. And, I just want to encourage you as you're listening to this right now, if there's somebody that you need to make amends with, that you need to ask for forgiveness for, or something, or even if it's like a hidden sin that you need to confess, I want to encourage you that it takes 3 seconds of courage to do that. Simply, I mean, your whole life can change with 3 seconds. 1, 2, 3. It only takes that long to like call that person, like to press call on your phone, or to send a text saying, please forgive me, or to say no to someone, or to like put in an application and for a dream job. But I want you to live a life of courage. And that's why I wrote this book, 3 Seconds of Courage, because I want you to feel that freedom and that peace. And you see, okay, guys, why bother? Why bother? Because we know it is so much easier to let fear be in the driver's seat of our life. That's the easier decision. It's so much easier to say no to that dream opportunity, or to not submit an application, or to not share your hidden talents with the world, or to say yes when really you want to say no. That's so much easier. But the reason why it's worth you living a life of courage is because 1, you deserve it. 2, God wants it for you. But 3, and this is the point I really want to focus on for a second, you have the chance to make such an impact on other people. I remember I was talking with my spiritual mentor one day about how I was sharing the story of the tsunami and how I wanted to just really overcome this fear of the ocean. And, I ended up beach lifeguarding for years. And in my book, I share the story of rescuing somebody who had drowned. And it was like this moment where it was the first time I would count to 3 and like encourage myself to live into 3 seconds of courage. And there was this man, it was very long story short, he was stormy day and he drowned, and I swam out to him and performed CPR. And by the grace of God, he came back to life. And I was talking to her about just like wanting to live this life where I had overcome this fear. And she said to me, she was like, Riley, do it because one day there's going to be a girl in a room that has a similar story to you and desperately needs your testimony. And flash forward many years later, I did my first TEDx talk at Grand Canyon University in Arizona. And I shared my story of the tsunami and shared how the story of performing CPR on that man, and how I now surf and I teach others to surf. And what if you turned your place that you feared into a place of victory and impact? And I got off the stage and this girl ran up to me and shared that she had a similar story, not in terms of like the tsunami story, but similar fears, and had very similar emotions, had experienced similar emotions. And she was like, thank you so much. Like, you don't know how much I needed this. And as she was telling me this, I was thinking, this is the girl that my spiritual mentor was talking about. And my friend, whatever it is that, as I've been talking, that fear that you've been thinking about, the fears that you've been thinking about, on the other side of you facing your fear is the gift of being able to help someone. It's the gift of being able to encourage someone that it is possible. And that is why I wrote this book. That is why I'm sitting here talking to you, because you can be like, I don't know if you've ever heard this, but deer, if you get like a baby deer and you put them in a paddock and in a field, and their fence is like 3 feet high, and they don't ever see anyone jump that fence, they won't realize they have the ability to jump even double the height of that fence. And that's what you can be to other people. You can jump fences of fear and teach others that it is possible to jump that height, if not even more. And as we close for today, I just want to encourage you, another fun fact is that psychologists say that 90% of personal growth occurs outside of your comfort zone. And courage is what pushes you outside of your comfort zone and into a place of growth. And as I end, I want to share one final story with you. I was in my first year of going to Fuller Seminary, and there's this guy that I had a crush on, and he was in soccer, and he told me, he was like, hey, like you should come and play soccer. And I was like, yeah, anything I can do to hang out with you. And so so I show up on the day of soccer and he'd asked me like, what's your soccer experience? And I was like, yeah, like pretty good. I was like, I feel like, like old kids growing up would like play soccer. But I didn't know how pro their team was. And I was totally like completely in the deep end. So I show up and it's this day, first day of my soccer game. And I don't even know why I wasn't able to make practice that week, but it's the day of my soccer game. And one of the people that came to watch me on my first big debut playing soccer was this old sweet man from my master's program named Albert. And Albert, he is one of my favorite people in the world. He had a few weeks at the beginning of that year when I started my master's program, I was asked to share my story. And I stand up there and I start sharing my story. And part of it was I was talking about surviving the tsunami. And I was holding this piece of paper with notes that I had that I wanted to like hit on in my talk. And my piece of paper was shaking. And he was one of the 28 people that was in my master's program. And he was in the back of the room. He's this sweet Asian man with like these like round glasses and the kindest eyes. And just like one of those people you look at and you just adore straight away. And he shouted out in the back of the classroom. He's like, you've got this, kid. And it became this thing where like before we had an exam or before we had to submit an assignment, he would email me, you've got this, kid. And so there he is, back to me, about to step on the field to play soccer with my crush, hopefully impress him. And I hear in the crowd, you've got this, kid. And there's Albert sitting there with like a rain jacket on. It was just so sweet. And we're playing. So the bell goes and I'm like, I got this. Like, let's go. Let's show off. Let's impress like my crush and make Albert proud. And it was like 15 minutes into the game and I haven't even touched the ball once. And I'm like, okay, come on, Riley, you got this. You got to get this. And like they'd even tried to like, my teammates had tried to kick the ball to me, but then I missed it. And I was just like, guys, I'm not that good at soccer. Okay. And then all of a sudden, 15 minutes in, I get past the ball and I start dribbling it. And I'm running so fast and that no one is getting even close to me. And I hear people shouting and screaming. And I'm like, and I'm getting closer and closer and closer to the goal. And I'm like, I'm about to do it. I'm about to make my crush so proud of me. I'm probably about to get a date. And I kick the ball into the goal and I scored. And then I notice, I know the goalie. That's our goalie. And I had kicked the soccer ball into our goal. And I was so embarrassed. And everyone was yelling at me, go the other way, the other way. And the reason no one wasn't catching up to me is because why would they? I'm going in the opposite direction. And a few minutes later, they subbed me out and I sat on the side so embarrassed. And this Albert walks up to me and he grabs me and we look at each other and then we both, like, I was like kind of about to cry. And then he starts laughing because he was like, that was the funniest thing of my life. He was like, you're going to officially have the shortest soccer career ever. And he starts laughing and then I start laughing. We're like laughing until we're crying. And he grabs me and he hugs me and he says, you've still got this, kid. And I want to end this podcast just saying that to you. You've got this. You have got this. And I pray that you find people like Albert, that you find courage cheerleaders in your life. And I pray that you, when you pick up this book and you read it or you listen to it on audiobook, that you realize that you've got this, that you hear my messy and vulnerable testimonies, times when I fail, times when I mess up, and you learn from my own mistakes. You avoid the potholes that I fell in, and know that God is standing on the sideline of your life with a massive sign saying, you've got this. And I stand on the sideline of your life and say, You've got this.